The family attorney pulled the official will from his heavy leather folder, cleared his throat, and looked me dead in the eyes. The silence in the room was so thick I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the antique clock on the wall. "Your father's entire estate," he began, his voice flat and professional, "including the $4 million logistics company, all active liquid bank accounts, and the family home in the suburbs, has been left entirely to Elena. Elena, she wasn't my sister. She wasn't my father's secret lover from the past. She was just the private night nurse who had only been in our house for exactly 8 months." My breath caught in my throat, a cold shock paralyzing my chest. I slowly turned my head to look across the polished mahogany table at my stepmother, Clara. I expected her to scream, to tear her hair out, to voice the same outrage that was currently suffocating me, but she didn't. Instead, Clara looked back at the quiet nurse sitting in the corner, and a slow, sharp, victorious smile spread across her face. She gave Elena a tiny, calculated nod. That was the exact second the fog in my mind cleared, and a terrifying reality took its place. My father didn't die of natural causes. He didn't just slip away after a long illness. He had been systematically and perfectly executed, and the trap had just snapped shut around me. My father, Arthur Vance, was a proud, self-made man. He built Vance Logistics from a single rented truck in Chicago into a massive corporation with a fleet of over 50 vehicles. When my biological mother passed away 10 years ago, my world shattered. But my father held me close and told me it was just the two of us against the world. He raised me with strict discipline, always emphasizing that family wasn't just a biological connection, it was a sacred bond of loyalty. He spent his entire life working 80-hour weeks, sacrificing his health, all to ensure that one day, everything he built would be mine. Not because he wanted me to be rich, but because he wanted his legacy to remain in safe, honest hands. I had built my own career as a surgeon, working brutal double shifts at Chicago Memorial, promising myself I'd never have to depend on his money. But I always knew one day his legacy would need someone he could trust. But 3 years ago, the dark shadow entered our lives. Her name was Clara. She was 15 years younger than my father, effortlessly elegant, with a soft, melodic voice that could charm anyone. My father was lonely, aging, and vulnerable. Clara played the role of the adoring, supportive partner perfectly. She baked his favorite pies, listened to his long stories about the logistics business, and rubbed his shoulders after hard days at the office. I saw through her calculation from the very first dinner. I noticed how her eyes scanned the expensive paintings in our living room, how she subtly asked about the company's annual revenue under the guise of being interested in his passions. But when I tried to warn my father, he just smiled and told me I was being overly protective. They were married within 6 months. The real nightmare began a year ago when my father's health took a sudden, drastic turn for the worse. The doctors diagnosed him with a rapidly progressive, degenerative neurological illness. Within months, the strong man who used to lift heavy engine parts with his bare hands was confined to a wheelchair, his speech slurring, his mind growing increasingly cloudy. Clara immediately took complete control of the household. She cut off his old friends, changed his phone number, and began managing his daily schedule. Every time I drove down to visit him, Clara would meet me at the door with a sad, fragile expression. "Oh, Nora, darling," she would whisper, blocking the hallway. "He just fell asleep. The medication makes him so tired. It breaks my heart to see him like this. Let's not disturb him." I allowed myself to be pushed away because I was consumed by my own grief, trusting that his wife was taking care of him. Then, 8 months ago, Clara announced that she could no longer handle his heavy medical equipment alone. Without consulting me, she hired Elena. Elena was quiet, plain, and barely spoke a word. She always kept her eyes glued to the floor whenever I was in the room, moving like a ghost through the corridors. Clara praised her constantly, calling her an angel sent from heaven. 2 days ago, my father's heart stopped. And now, sitting in this cold attorney's office, staring at the official legal document bearing his forged, trembling signature, I realized how blind I had been. My stepmother and this strange nurse hadn't just stolen my family's wealth. They had stolen my father's last days on earth, They had turned his own home into a prison. But as Clara exchanged that triumphant nod with Elena, she made one fatal mistake. She looked at me and saw a grieving, broken girl who would accept her fate and walk away. She forgot whose blood ran through my veins. She forgot that I was Arthur Vance's daughter, and I was about to turn their perfect victory into an absolute living hell. The human mind has a remarkable, almost frightening capacity to reject horror until the facts strip you of every possible excuse. As I drove away from the attorney's office, the city of Chicago outside my window felt distant, blurry, and gray. I didn't shed a single tear. Tears are a currency for people who accept defeat, and my father had spent 32 years ensuring I would never become a victim. My chest felt tight, but my mind was shifting into a state of pure, icy precision. I needed facts. I needed data. The very first thing I did was drive straight to the main branch of the bank where my father had maintained his corporate and personal accounts for 3 decades. Because I was still legally listed as a secondary administrator on his historical logistics accounts from the years before Clara systematically cut me off, the bank manager couldn't deny my request. An hour later, I was sitting in the cramped interior of my car in the furthest corner of the bank's parking lot. My laptop was resting heavily against the steering wheel, its screen illuminating the dark afternoon. I began digging through 12 months of digital statements, line by line, transaction by transaction. I was looking for anomalies. I was looking for the footprints they forgot to wipe away. And then, less than 2 hours into my search, I found the first major fracture in their perfect crime. 6 months ago, during a period when my father was already completely bedridden and struggling to even recognize my face, a corporate checking account under Vance Logistics had issued 3 separate wire transfers. Each transfer was for exactly $15,000. But it was the recipient that made my breath hitch. The funds hadn't gone to a local medical supply company, nor had they gone to pay his regular doctors. The recipient was a highly exclusive private clinic located in Zurich, Switzerland. According to the digital scanned copies of the checks, my father had signed them himself. The signature was fluid, strong, and perfectly legible. But my stomach turned to lead as I stared at the screen. 6 months ago, my father's hands shook so violently from his neurological illness that he couldn't even hold a soup spoon without spilling it. It was physically impossible for him to have signed those documents. Clara had forged them. But why the clinic in Switzerland? I spent the next hour translating and digging through the clinic's public medical registry. It wasn't a hospital for healing. It was a private institution specializing in advanced sedation protocols and experimental chemical cognitive suppression. They weren't treating him. They were buying heavy, unprescribed foreign sedatives to keep him completely compliant, ensuring his mind was too foggy to ever question why his daughter was no longer allowed in his bedroom. The anger inside me turned from hot rage into a freezing, calculated focus. To find the rest of the puzzle, I needed professional help. I immediately called Robert, a retired federal fraud detective who now ran a high-end private investigation firm. I gave him everything I had: Elena's full name, Clara's background, and the Swiss bank details. "Give me a few hours, Nora," Robert had told me, his voice gravelly and calm. "People who steal millions always leave a trail. They can't help themselves." I waited. I sat in that parking lot as the sun went down, watching the rain begin to pelt against my windshield. When my dashboard screen finally lit up with Robert's incoming call, I snatched the phone before the first ring could even finish. "Nora," Robert said, and I could immediately hear the heavy rustle of printed records on his end of the line. His tone was deeply unsettled. "We have a massive problem. Your stepmother didn't find that night nurse through any licensed medical agency or registry. I ran her fingerprints and her social security number through the state database. Her name isn't Elena." I gripped the steering wheel, my phone pressed tightly to my ear. "What do you mean it's not her name?" "Her real name is Sarah Miller," Robert said, pausing to let the weight of the words sink in. "And here's the first blow, Nora. She isn't a licensed nurse at all. She was completely barred from the state medical registry 4 years ago." "Do you want to know why?" "Tell me, Robert," I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. "She was caught red-handed administering unauthorized, heavy sedatives to an elderly patient in a premium nursing home downtown. The patient's family sued, her license was revoked, and she narrowly avoided jail time because of a technicality. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. She was drugging him, I muttered, the horrific image of my father lying helpless in his bed, flashing through my mind. Clara bought the drugs from Switzerland, and Sarah administered them. Hold on, because it gets worse, Robert cut in, his voice dropping an octave. I didn't stop there. I started looking into how a banned medical worker from Chicago accidentally ends up in your father's house via Clara. I traced their financial histories back 5 years. 3 years ago, before your father ever met Clara. Clara and this fake nurse were listed as co-defendants in a massive civil lawsuit regarding a disputed inheritance in the state of Indiana. I sat frozen, the air completely leaving my lungs. A disputed inheritance? Yes, Robert said, the sound of his pen tapping against the desk echoing through the speaker. An elderly, wealthy university professor passed away and left his entire estate to his brand new younger wife, Clara. The professor's children fought it, claiming he was heavily medicated by his private caregiver. That caregiver was Sarah Miller. They settled out of court for a fraction of the estate, wiped their records, changed cities, and executed their next target. Nora. Your father wasn't an accidental victim. This is a professional syndicate. They've done this exact same thing before. The sheer scale of the evil settling into my life was dizzying. They hadn't just stolen my father's money. They had hunted him. They had targeted a lonely, wealthy man, systematically isolated him from the only person who loved him, chemically forced his compliance, and legally erased me from his existence. They thought they were geniuses. They thought they had covered every single base. Right at that exact moment, my phone buzzed with an incoming text message. It was from Clara. The formal probate court hearing to legally validate your father's will and finalize the transfer of the estate has been scheduled for tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. in room 4. Don't bother showing up to make a scene, Nora. It is already over. Move on with your life. I stared at the glowing text on the screen, a slow, cold smile finally creeping onto my face. She was right about one thing: we were definitely going to court. But it wasn't going to end with her inheriting my father's empire. It was going to end with her watching it burn. The grand probate courtroom of Cook County was the epitome of cold, institutional power. High marble walls, polished walnut benches, and the oppressive hum of the air conditioning created an atmosphere where lives were legally rearranged with the stroke of a pen. It was 9:45 a.m., and the public benches were already filled with estate lawyers, court clerks, and a handful of local investigative journalists who tracked high-value estate disputes. Clara sat at the front defense table looking like a portrait of tragic elegance. She wore a tailored, designer black wool dress, a single strand of pearls around her neck, and a delicate black veil pushed slightly back from her face. She was playing the grieving, heartbroken widow to absolute perfection. Sitting right beside her was Sarah Miller, still dressed in her plain, oversized knit sweater and holding a tissue, maintaining her facade as the humble, innocent night nurse who had simply been blessed by a dying man's final act of generosity. At exactly 10 a.m., the bailiff slammed the heavy wooden gavel. All rise for the Honorable Judge Thomas Sterling. The judge, a stern man with 30 years of estate law experience, took his seat and adjusted his glasses, looking down at the thick stack of folders in front of him. We are here today to finalize the probate and validate the final will and testament of the late Arthur Vance, Judge Sterling announced, his voice booming through the microphone. The court has reviewed the document signed on September 14th, witnessed by the household staff and certified by the notary. Are there any formal legal objections from the surviving family before I sign the executive transfer? Clara's attorney stood up, smoothing his expensive suit jacket. The defense rests on the ironclad nature of the document, Your Honor. The estate belongs entirely to Ms. Elena, as per Mr. Vance's explicit written wishes. We ask the court to finalize the transfer immediately so my client can begin the process of mourning in peace. The judge raised his pen, ready to sign the document that would legally strip me of my father's legacy forever. I object, Your Honor. The heavy double oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a loud thud. The entire room went dead silent as the echo of my high heels began to reverberate off the marble floor. I walked down the center aisle, my posture perfectly straight, wearing a sharp, tailored crimson blazer, a deliberate contrast to the sea of black and gray in the room. Every single head turned to look at me. Clara stiffened instantly, her shoulders locking as she turned around. When her eyes met mine, her perfect, grieving facade cracked for a split second, revealing a flash of ugly, venomous panic. Dr. Vance, Judge Sterling said, his pen hovering in the air, his brow furrowing. This is a formal probate proceeding. If you do not have legal representation or a certified forensic objection, I cannot halt the signing based on emotional distress. I am not here with emotion, Your Honor. I am here with a criminal indictment, I said clearly, stepping up to the central podium and placing a thick, leather-bound binder onto the wooden railing. What you are holding on your desk is a product of grand larceny, identity theft, and systematic chemical coercion. Whispers erupted across the public benches. The journalists in the back row instantly leaned forward, their pens flying across their notebooks. Clara's attorney jumped to his feet, his face turning bright red. Objection! Your Honor, this is outrageous. Dr. Vance is a disgruntled, disinherited daughter who is making slanderous accusations to delay the legal process. I demand she be removed by security. Quiet down, counselor. Judge Sterling snapped. His eyes locked on the binder I had just submitted. He signaled the bailiff to bring the documents up to the bench. Dr. Vance, you have exactly 2 minutes to explain these allegations before I hold you in contempt. 6 months ago, I began, my voice steady, carrying into every corner of the silent room. Vance Logistics Accounts issued 3 separate wire transfers of $15,000 each to a private medical institution in Zurich, Switzerland. That institution specializes in advanced sedation protocols and cognitive suppression drugs. My father did not sign those checks. His hands were shaking so violently from his neurological condition that he couldn't hold a pen, let alone write a fluent signature. Clara Vance forged those corporate checks to illegally import medical-grade sedatives into this country. You are insane. You are lying. Clara screamed from her table, completely forgetting her role as the elegant widow. She slammed her hands on the polished wood, her voice screeching. My husband loved me. He wanted to protect me from you. Order! Sit down, Mrs. Vance. The judge thundered, his gavel slamming down like a gunshot. He looked back at the medical and financial records in his hands, his expression growing incredibly dark. Continue, Dr. Vance. The sedatives were not meant for treatment, Your Honor, I said, turning my head slightly to look directly at the trembling girl sitting next to Clara. They were meant to keep my father in a state of permanent cognitive paralysis, so he could never question why I was barred from entering his home. And the woman administering those drugs is not a certified nurse named Elena. Her real name is Sarah Miller. At the sound of her real name, the fake nurse gasped, her hands shaking so violently she dropped her tissue. Sarah Miller is a banned medical worker whose license was permanently revoked 4 years ago for criminally drugging an elderly patient. I continued, my voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. And she is not a stranger to my stepmother. 3 years ago in the state of Indiana, Clara Vance and Sarah Miller were co-defendants in a massive civil fraud lawsuit where they used the exact same sedation protocol to steal the estate of an elderly university professor. The courtroom erupted into total chaos. The flashbulbs of the journalists' cameras began going off, illuminating the panic on the antagonists' faces. Clara's attorney slowly sat back down, completely abandoning his client as he realized the quick, easy payout he had been promised was turning into a career-ending nightmare. This is a conspiracy. She fabricated these documents, Clara yelled, her face twisted in rage, her eyes darting toward the exit doors. But the trap didn't just stop there. I looked back at the double doors of the courtroom. Your Honor, I have already submitted this evidence to the State Financial Crimes Division, and Detective Robert is standing outside with a warrant. The doors opened again, and 3 federal agents in dark suits, accompanied by 2 uniformed Chicago police officers, walked into the room. Sarah Miller completely broke. The pressure, the public humiliation, and the sight of the badges were too much for her weak nerves. She fell off her chair, collapsing onto the courtroom carpet, weeping hysterically as her tears ruined her makeup. "It was Clara!" Sarah shrieked, pointing a shaking, manicured finger up at my stepmother. "She planned everything. She bought the drugs. She told me she would give me half the company if I just kept the old man quiet while she guided his hand on the paper. Please don't lock me up. It was all her." Judge Sterling slammed his gavel down one final time, his face a mask of absolute disgust. "Bailiffs, secure the courtroom. Officers, execute your warrants. This probate proceeding is officially halted, the will is suspended, and I am referring this entire file to the state prosecutor for immediate criminal trial." As the police officers stepped over the wooden railing, the metallic clicks of the handcuffs echoed through the large room. Clara Vance stood frozen as an officer pulled her arms behind her back. She looked at me through her tangled black veil, her eyes filled with pure, unadulterated hatred. I didn't blink. I didn't look away. I stood right at the podium, watching her get dragged down the center aisle in front of the flashing cameras and the whispering crowd. She had taken my father's last breaths in secret, but her downfall was completely, utterly public. The wheels of justice turn slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. With Sarah Miller turning state's witness to save herself from a lifetime behind bars, the criminal trial was swift and brutal. The forensic accountants traced every single dollar Clara had funneled out of my father's accounts, and the medical examiners confirmed the presence of the Swiss cognitive suppressants in my father's preserved medical records. Clara Vance was sentenced to a mandatory 8 years in a maximum security state penitentiary for grand larceny, corporate fraud, and conspiracy to commit grievous bodily harm. Sarah Miller received 4 years for her role in the chemical abuse. The forged will was officially declared null and void by the state of Illinois, and the court restored my father's entire $4 million estate, the logistics company, and the family home to its rightful, only heir. Me. 2 weeks after the final sentencing, I walked into the headquarters of Vance Logistics. I didn't walk in as a visitor, and I didn't walk in as a grieving daughter. I walked in as the chief executive officer. My first order of business was to fire every corrupt manager and lazy administrator Clara had brought into the building to milk the company dry. In their places, I promoted the loyal, hard-working staff who had stood by my father for 20 years, helping him build the business from a single truck into an empire. Later that evening, I sat in his old leather executive chair, looking out through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the glittering skyline of Chicago. For the first time in an entire year, the heavy, suffocating weight of grief and anger lifted from my chest. I turned my head and looked at the framed black and white photograph of my father, resting on the mahogany desk. I had kept my promise. His life's work was finally safe, and his name was cleared. Clara and Sarah Miller thought they could exploit a vulnerable, sick man's loneliness. They thought they could erase his daughter with a single piece of forged paper and a few drops of poison. But they forgot one fundamental truth. Real power isn't built on deception, greed, and shadows. It is built on loyalty, truth, and the absolute courage to stand up and fight back when everything you love is on the line. If this story reminded you that no matter how clever the trap is, the truth will always find a way to light, drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you are listening from tonight. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss our next story on EverStory. Good night.